Hi everyone. Before we get started with our episode today, just a reminder we have Facebook and Twitter groups. You can search History's Most on either of those platforms to join us. And most importantly, we now have a Patreon, patreon.com/historiesmost, where you can support us for either $1 a month or $5 a month to become an executive producer of the show, like Jeremy Marcoux is. And if you sign up for our Patreon this month, you are entered into a prize draw to win a biography of Oliver Cromwell.
A big thank you to our patrons, and a big thank you to all of our listeners for all your support. Imagine you're a nobleman in medieval Europe. How high do you think you could rise? Through military feats, could you carve out a kingdom? Might you use marriage alliances to advance your family? How about wheeling and dealing your way into becoming king and leading a crusade? Would you be able to bounce back from losing your throne to receive an even higher title, to become an emperor? Because that's exactly what our subject today achieved in history's most varied career. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another very, very special episode of History's Most Varied Career. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and today we're going to look at an individual who, in the medieval world, in the crusading world, did it all. We're going to look at a man called John of Brienne, a French nobleman who went on to claim, well, some very important positions, but in very strange ways. And to do that, we are joined by, I think it's fair to say, the world expert in John of Brienne, and that is Guy Perry. He is principal at Middlebury College of the CMRS Oxford Humanities Programme, as well as being associate professor at Middlebury and fellow by special election of Keble College, Oxford. Guy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, John of Brienne, set the scene for us. The Briennes are a noble family in France in the Middle Ages. Are they a kind of very powerful family? Are they the maybe lower nobility? What background is John from?
So the Briennes are what you might call a mid-ranking family. They come from Champagne, which is in central eastern France, but they're not the boss even in that region. The boss of the region is the Count of Champagne, who is above them, and above the Count of Champagne is the king. So you're going down at least 2 rungs to get to the Brienne family. So they're not minor by any means, but they are very much regional aristocracy.
And so John is born in the late 12th century, and his family were associated with crusading in the past. Is that true?
Yes, that's right. The family had a long sort of family tradition of crusading. At one stage, it was thought they'd taken part in every major crusade in the 12th century. So not just the first back in the 11th century, but the second and third as well. It may be the case, in fact, that they didn't participate in the first, but instead went on, as it were, lesser crusades between the first and second. One of the things we often forget is, although that there are big numbered crusades, there are also lots of other little expeditions in between. And the Briennes help us see that bigger picture. But basically, there's a long history of involvement in crusading. But what's been the case up until John is people go on crusade and then they come home. The difference is that John is the beginning of making his whole career, if you like, in the East.
So John is from this, as we say, he's from a noble background. He's from a family that's got a tradition of going out campaigning in the East. And yet, when he does kind of come of age and decide to go out to the East, it's not on a crusade.
That's right. The backstory is a little complicated, but essentially, what happens is that he ends up being chosen as King of Jerusalem. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as I'm sure you know, is the leading Crusader state out there in the East. At this stage, it doesn't actually include Jerusalem itself. The city of Jerusalem is just out of reach, but there is a Kingdom of Jerusalem still existing on the coast. And its mission statement, if you like, is to get back its capital, to get back Jerusalem. And in many ways, the first amazing fact about John's career is that this mid-ranking figure is selected, is for the job of being King of Jerusalem, of marrying the heiress to that kingdom, a woman called Maria, and taking over the kingdom. And basically, he goes out from the west to the east to take up this post of being king.
I want to delve into that slightly. How and why does John get picked to be King of Jerusalem? I mean, I presume it wasn't a prize draw that you have to send away for. Why did the kingdom need a king from outside?
Right. I mean, so it is very complicated. And one of the things that I found in researching it is that I really don't have all the answers. And all I can do is offer a few guesses, essentially. But there's a long tradition, basically, of when the kingdom gets into trouble, what you do is you look for help from the West. And you want basically the strongest Western figure you can to come out and take over rule. And hopefully he will bring with him manpower, money, connections, all the things that you want to strengthen your position in the East. And the best way to persuade somebody to come out and take over is if you can offer them the kingdom and take the kingship when they arrive. So it's not a bad deal, basically, come out and be a king. It's a difficult frontier life, but there are good rewards in return. The problem is that John is really not top-notch. So the question is, why do you end up with him? One of the interesting things is there are bigger and better candidates flying around at this point. The obvious one is King Peter of Aragon, and he's a completely different league as a figure from John, but his candidacy falls through, and John ends up taking the role. So the big question is how does he get it? Well, there's various things going on. One thing seems to be there are people in the East who are promoting his candidacy. So his boss within Champagne, the Countess Blanche of Champagne, is clearly promoting him. She wants her man to get the job. There are other key figures in the East. The regent of Cyprus, which is sister kingdom to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that figure is also a close relative and is also pushing for him to get the job. There seem to be lots of other people who have a background from Champagne in the Latin East at this point, and for them too, there's an advantage in one of their own becoming King of Jerusalem. But there are other things to it as well. I mean, he's available, he's mature, he's unmarried, he seems to be of significant military prowess. So the basic message seems to be, if you can't have a top-notch figure, then the next best thing is a not quite top-notch figure who has really good connections. And John seems to fit that bill.
Right, so he's kind of the least worst option. Why is the King of Jerusalem? What situation is it in when he is picked as the least worst man to be king of it? What situation is the kingdom in? We know they lost Jerusalem, which was the trigger for the Third and Fourth Crusades to try and get it back. We know, obviously, you've said that the person on the throne, Maria, so there obviously wasn't a male heir. What was the situation in this kingdom that John found himself being catapulted into?
It's a curious position because on the one hand, it's a very vulnerable kingdom sort of stuck on the coast, basically, surrounded by mighty Muslim forces. Saladin's old empire, he's now dead, but his brother is in charge, the Ayyubid Empire, which basically surrounds the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So in that respect, it looks tremendously vulnerable. On the other hand, though, the Ayyubids, that is Saladin's family, are far more interested in fighting amongst themselves for dominance in the Near East than they are with driving the Westerners into the sea. So it is at the same time a precarious kingdom clinging on, but actually it seems to be okay. It seems to be doing fine, clinging just to its coast. The big thing the Westerners want to do, though, is to get back the city of Jerusalem. And this is a tall order. This is going to be difficult to do without significant, meaningful support from the West.
Okay, so John arrives. When does he arrive, by the way?
In 1210.
1210, he arrives in Jerusalem. He obviously marries Maria, becomes king. And then what? Is he a massive success as king of Jerusalem, or as with history's most episodes, often does it start to unravel and go wrong?
Yeah, it starts to go wrong pretty quickly. There are various things that go wrong right from the start. So one of which is he has brought out with him a very small expedition, a small crusade, if you like, sort of retinue crusade, and it a bit like him. He's not great. It isn't great. It doesn't do particularly well, to be frank, and that might suggest to the Jerusalemites that they have got a king, but perhaps he isn't brilliant. A bigger problem, though, comes to the fact that John is only king because he's married to the Queen, Maria, and 2 years later, she dies in childbirth at the end of 1212, and this produces a bit of a crisis. So John has become king because he married this woman. She's now dead. So does that mean his right to be king dies with her? Well, he has a trump card, which is the fact that Maria died giving birth to a daughter, Isabella. And it seems to make sense to a lot of people that who should be the guardian and protector of a little girl? Well, her father, if he's there and available. So John's line is, I might have been king by marriage, but in fact, I'm now going to carry on being king, this time as protector for my little daughter. But it does raise big questions about what's going to happen in the long term, because eventually she's going to grow up, assuming she survives. Eventually, she's going to be married, and then the question would be, does John then get booted out of the kingship, or does he get to retain it for life? And that will be a question that comes back later to haunt him.
What was the kind of legality of his situation? Was this kind of normal, common thing to happen in that, I guess, a listener might say, well, he married the Queen, and surely in medieval times that means whatever the Queen possesses is his, and yet he seems to be on very shaky legal ground here. He doesn't own the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He's just acting as regent for an infant daughter.
Yes, I mean, he wouldn't accept that he's acting as regent, so he doesn't change his title to be regent. He keeps the title of king all the way through. The legal question is difficult, there's no doubt about it. The Kingdom of Jerusalem has in fact never had this situation before, where there is a little daughter, but her father is still living. That's never been the case before. But what is the case is the general principle that a child should be looked after in the last resort by their parent, if there is a parent. So I think that's what John is able to take advantage of. He's able to take advantage of that feeling. But not everybody agrees. Naturally, if you are politically hostile to him, you point to what he's doing and say it's lacking in legality. And the Ibelin family, very hostile to him, make exactly that point. But the vast majority of people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the vast majority of politically powerful people, seem to accept his line of argument, which is the best protection we can give my daughter, the Queen, and the kingdom is for me to carry on ruling as king.
So John is in this situation. He's in a slightly weird legal position. He's not got everyone, in terms of the powerful people in Jerusalem, or the Kingdom of Jerusalem, I should say, behind him. So, as we go through that first decade of his rule, the 1210s, is he, in a weak position politically? Is he able to get anything done? Is he a good king of Jerusalem? It's
a curiously empty period. We know surprisingly little about it, really, this sort of first 7 years of his rule between 1210 and 1217, when the Fifth Crusade begins. What little evidence we have suggests that those who were very hostile to him have walked out in disgust, and the vast majority of people have accepted his continued rule, and it seems to be going perfectly okay. So again, it fits our basic thesis. It's not brilliant, but it's perfectly all right.
What was the reason that there was such hostility? The Ibelins, I think, do they leave to go to Cyprus? They're one of the great families of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Why so much hate for John?
It's an interesting question. One of the possibilities is that John of Evelyn, the head of the Evelyn family, had been the regent before John turned up. So if you like, he'd effectively held royal power and then surrendered it to John. And maybe he thought that he could effectively control this newcomer who didn't understand the East in its ways. And this newcomer would be dependent on him. And therefore the Ebelyns would continue, in effect, to run the show in the East. And when that didn't happen, when John proved to be his own man, when he had his own group of fellow people from Champagne who he could turn to for support and backing, the Ebelyns may have felt they lost out, basically, in a struggle for power. And when that's the case, being able to point to legal weaknesses in your opponent's position is a very good thing to do. And the Ebelyns are past master at this. They become very, very good at tarring their enemies with accusations of illegal behavior.
So a bit of a kind of personal power politics rather than an issue over policy, maybe, which isn't exactly surprising.
Very, very, very much so. Power politics dressed up in the language of law, essentially.
Yeah. Okay, well, we presaged it a little bit. There was that there is a crusade coming, the Fifth Crusade, and listeners will be familiar if they've listened to our, I think it was episode 13, History's Worst Friendly Fire Incident. We talked about the Fourth Crusade. The target of the Fourth Crusade, which they never got to in the end, was Egypt. Attack Egypt, break Muslim power in the region, and it will allow the Kingdom of Jerusalem to reclaim their capital. And that basic strategy was repeated for the Fifth Crusade, except this time they actually went to Egypt. They got there. And John apparently, seemingly, has a key role in this crusade. He goes out there to, he hopes, lead it. Yeah. What happens?
It proves to be a pretty tricky enterprise, frankly. So John goes out to the Fifth Crusade in the hope of being its leader. And it's worth stressing this is quite unusual. Normally, a crusade will be led by the greatest Western figure coming out, not by the people they're coming to help, which is the Easterners, the people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. John does, in fact, get the job of being leader, but this is largely because no other kings have turned up. He's the highest ranking figure there. So again, top job, but by default, basically. It then proves quite a difficult campaign to run, not least because it gets bogged down into this enormous siege at a port called Damietta, this 18-month slog. The longest static campaign, as it's often said, in the history of crusading, basically, sitting around this city trying to break it, which takes forever. And there are added political complications too, one of which is the church has much more power than it's had for a long time. The papal legate, who's called Pelagius, has a lot of power in his pocket and is ready to use it. This is often seen as a sort of church v state struggle for control of crusading, but that's not quite fair. What's actually happening is the church has its own candidate for the leadership. And this is the German Emperor Frederick II, who's the greatest figure in the Western world. And they really want him to turn up and lead the crusade. And Pelagius sees his mission as basically making the crusade ready for Frederick to arrive to take over. From John's perspective, all this is an annoyance and a distraction. And until Frederick shows up, he's determined that he will be in charge and call the shots. The results are lots of arguments as the crusade proceeds.
And I mean, the 18-month siege at Damietta, I mean, that makes Antioch look like a picnic. Is the army, as happened in the First Crusade at Antioch, really the army power and fighting strength drains away after months and months of static siege warfare? Is all the impetus and momentum drained out of the Fifth Crusade as well?
Quite a lot of it is. It's not quite as simple as once you get around it and you're sitting there besieging a city, things necessarily get worse. Because you remember that in the First Crusade, the army has basically marched along across land, and any reinforcements will also have to come by land, and that's a big ask in hostile territory. Whereas once you're dealing with a port, an Egyptian port, it's much, much easier for troops to come and go. They can basically get on an Italian ship, and Italian ships are constantly crossing between Egypt and the West. So, yeah, they do lose impetus. Yes, the army begins to flag and numbers begin to diminish. But on the other hand, it's also getting reinforcements from the west, which are arriving at Damietta twice every year. So it's less harmful than you might think.
So John, does he succeed in his leadership bid to be the leader of the crusade? Does he get the respect as the only king there that he feels he deserves?
Up to a point, I think would be the answer. He's interested in respect and being recognised as the supreme commander of the campaign, and he certainly seems to get that as the leading military figure who's there. But he's also interested in being leader for other reasons. Being leader also means that he would be entitled to the lion's share of the spoils from anything they capture. Being the leader would mean he would get to make key decisions about political diplomatic matters, and the Muslims are making peace overtures to the Crusaders at the time. So in the end, he does get his way in the sense that his leadership is recognized until the Emperor Frederick shows up, and in the end, Frederick never does. But it's very much a negotiated leadership. He's not dominating the crusade in the way that previous rulers have done. He's having to negotiate and bargain and deal with lots of others. He's chairman rather than in complete control, if you like.
Kind of first among equals,
which
kind of fits his background really as a kind of middle tier noble, albeit with a crown that he's kind of got by hook and by crook. So they're at Damietta and eventually they capture it. What happens next? Does the crusade succeed?
Well, then we have one of the most bizarre moments in any crusade, which is, you've finally taken this port city and cracked the route into Egypt. And exactly at that point, virtually nothing happens for about a year. And big question of how do we get into this situation? Well, from John's position, he amazingly takes this opportunity to go back to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where he does a lot of things, and in particular seems to be interested in getting another crown, which is in Cilician Armenia, which is on the borders between what's now Turkey and Syria. And he gets a lot of abuse that this is a king who's abandoned the cause of Christ in order to basically pursue a career of self-aggrandizement and get more crowns. Again, it's not quite fair. He is interested in building up his portfolio of crowns, no doubt. He's also dealing with the fact that his money and men are exhausted and essentially need a break and a pause if they can get one. He's also worried about the fact that whilst all the Crusaders are concentrated in Egypt, there's a big chance that the Muslims will work out that the Holy Land is badly defended and walk into it whilst the Crusaders are absent. So a good part of him abandoning the crusade and going back to the Holy Land is to protect it, in fact, from Muslim attack. And he also seems to take this view that they've done the first part of the crusade, which is they've cracked open Egypt. Now you're waiting for Frederick II to arrive and lead the whole crusade to victory. And that's what he thinks is going to happen, or maybe hopes is going to happen. As it turns out, though, Frederick doesn't show up. And in the end, John is basically summoned back to Damietta to take part in a big push in the direction of Cairo. And this seems to be the task that virtually all crusades find impossible to do. Grabbing a bit of the edge of Egypt is easy enough. Marching across the flooded Nile Delta to Cairo seems to be impossible. And later crusades, St. Louis' crusade, struggles with exactly this problem. So the Crusaders march a fair amount of the way, but then they are cut off and surrounded. The Nile gets flooded, and eventually they are forced to surrender. So it comes to a very nasty end, and all this time Frederick II has not appeared.
So it all ends in disaster. Does John himself get captured?
Yeah, he does, along with Pelagius, the legate, and the leaders of the main military orders. All the bigwigs, basically, during a comfortable period of captivity, where we get told they're treated very well. This is diplomatic imprisonment, whilst everybody works out what they're going to do next politically.
And so presumably then there's a negotiated settlement. Do they have to give back all the gains they'd made?
Exactly. They have to give back what they've made. They have to get out of Egypt. The only concession they seem to be able to get is that this deal will not be binding on Frederick should he ever finally turn up. So the right to continue the campaign is left to him. But essentially, this has been a bit of a disaster.
on the kind of crusading disaster scale, which is pretty high. There's some
Yeah.
really, really, really big disasters. I mean, the Fourth Crusade is one we talked about. Is this campaign that John's led seriously disastrous, or is it just a big disaster?
The disaster scale is so hard to measure. I mean, in terms of sort of absolute catastrophe, does it affect much in the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Not very much. Does it stop Frederick II from coming when he's ready? No, not really. So in that sense, it doesn't look like a big disaster. But on the other hand, this crusade took years to put together. It was a vast international undertaking. It's been an issue that's been in the conscience of the Western world for a very, very long time. And it's ended in disaster. In future, there will be multinational crusades where everybody gets together and tries to go together under the Pope's leadership. But more and more, these crusades will be led by one king and one particular group, the French, the Germans, or whatever. So there is this sense that this is kind of catastrophic in that it's really damaged the idea that you can get together and fight a successful campaign, because the problems of coordination, just how difficult it is to mount, really seem to be insuperable.
So the Fifth Crusade has failed. It's probably, I guess, dented John's reputation somewhat, given he was desperate to have responsibility for this crusade. And it's now ended in disaster. So we're I think, about 1221 now.
Yep.
And he's back in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. What next?
I mean, so the basic message that the Fifth Crusade has taught is it's all gone wrong, and so you need to try again. The West needs to make another great big effort. And one of the big ideas is that everybody from the East, or the key figures from the East, will go back to the West to talk to the Pope about what to do next, about organizing the next big crusade, and talk to the Emperor Frederick, who was meant to turn up and didn't. So John goes back to the West, and in the end, it's going to be a very long period there of almost a decade. And so it's not quite a crusade in a reverse, but it's slightly odd that a king of Jerusalem this time goes back to the West rather than coming out to the East. And he goes back to the West and engages in a conference with the big powers, above all the Pope and the Emperor. And the key thing that comes out of this meeting is it's agreed that the Emperor Frederick himself will marry John's daughter, Isabella, who's the heiress to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And she's now, she's about 10 or 11 years old. So in due course, she will marry the emperor, who's much older. So we're back to this point about when the Kingdom of Jerusalem's in trouble, you call for help from the West. Except before, you got a mid-ranking ruler from Champagne. Now you're getting the German emperor and king of Sicily, the greatest power in the West. If I was going to offer a cheap caricature of this, it's a bit like deciding that modern Israel is in trouble and you entrust it to the President of the United States. It's that level of, who have you gone for this time? This is as big as it gets.
Fascinating scenario, but I assume that then, given that they have Frederick II, as you say, German emperor, most powerful monarch in the Western world, if John couldn't save the Kingdom of Jerusalem, surely this is a brilliant solution.
That's the idea. It doesn't work out like that. And one of the reasons that it doesn't work out is that John and Frederick don't get on. So the marriage takes place in 1225, and John has clearly agreed to the marriage on the principle that Frederick will be his successor as King of Jerusalem, but that he, John, will keep the Kingdom of Jerusalem for life. Frederick, I think, has played a bit of a double deal here. And the moment he's married the Queen of Jerusalem, Isabella, he promptly turfs John off his throne and says, right, I'm now the king, I'm now in charge, which causes one hell of a problem. So you were supposed to have John and Frederick working together, with John as king and Frederick as his successor. And instead what you've got is Frederick has instantly done a power play and taken possession of the kingdom.
Right. Again, there's a kind of legal question here, isn't there? Because Frederick, in a way, is in the right in the sense that he's married to the heir of Jerusalem, the girl Isabella, who is the queen, the person that John's been acting as, I know, not technically regent, but effectively as guardian until she grows up. Now she's married, and her husband is ready to be king. He's not a child, is
Yeah.
Frederick II. He doesn't need John to look after his kingdoms for him. But was there, did John have a leg to stand on then? Did people really think, oh, Frederick's done him, a disservice here?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I think there is a strong sense that Frederick has broken the rules in the sense that he made a deal and then didn't stick to it. But the other points you're making are still absolutely valid. There's no doubt that in law, Frederick has right on his side. He is the husband to the reigning queen, therefore he is the king. And there's the other point about what you want in a king of Jerusalem. In the last resort, you want somebody who's going to protect you. And who would you rather do that? Mr. Random from Champagne or the greatest ruler in the Western world? So I'm afraid it's no surprise that given the option, the vast majority of people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem back Frederick. And this includes a lot of the people whom John has been friends with and has built the careers of. He's basically abandoned. He's a king who's lost his kingdom.
There's in several points in John's life, there's a real sense of tragedy, I think, a forlorn man.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. And he doesn't take it very well. He immediately starts, I believe, acting basically against the interests of Frederick, which de facto is against the interests of his former kingdom, and not least his own daughter, who is the heiress.
That's right. He basically spends a lot of time running up and down Italy trying to create trouble for Frederick, and trying to get the Pope to support him in getting his throne back. It doesn't go very well, to be quite frank. As long as the Pope and the Emperor see eye to eye, John is politically outclassed, and he's not going to be able to get any meaningful political support. But if the Pope and Emperor fall out, then suddenly political prospects are on the cards once again.
Well, I'm guessing from what you're saying then that things do go wrong between the Emperor and the Pope, and I'm guessing, again, that John sees that as a great opportunity to have some redress. Yes,
and this is one of the most shocking and surprising of all medieval crusades. In some ways, this is my favourite of the crusades. This is Frederick II's crusade. So he's finally going to the east like he's been promising for a very long time. And of course, from his point of view, he's coming to visit his own kingdom. But there's lots of problems. Firstly, he's fallen out with the Pope, which is a major issue. He's been promising to go on crusade for a very long time, and he hasn't gone when he was supposed to go exactly on time. In fact, there's a good reason for this. He's very ill, but the Pope is not willing to accept this, and promptly excommunicates Frederick, throws him out of the church, and begins to make plans to lead a war against Frederick in Italy. So that's problem one. But problem two is that whilst Frederick is recuperating, his wife, that's John's daughter, also dies. So he's now in exactly the position that John was earlier. He got the throne through marriage, but the person he was married to has died. Again, though, in this case, there's a child. So there's a little son in this case, Conrad IV. And Frederick does exactly what John did. He says, well, there you go. I'm now the king as guardian for my child. So doing exactly what he wouldn't have let John do earlier. So the situation has become much more contorted and much more difficult. And it leads the way to a big conflict, which is called the War of the Keys. What happens in this conflict is essentially that John is hired by the Pope to be the commander in trying to bring Frederick down in Sicily, in Italy. At one and the same time, Frederick is actually out in the east trying to win back Jerusalem. It's absurdly complex and seems really, really bizarre that the Pope is trying to bring down a crusader, and what's more, a crusader who actually wins Jerusalem back by negotiation. That's why it's the oddest of the crusade, and that's why in many ways I find it the most interesting and enjoyable.
Once again, it's kind of power politics overplaying what we would, looking back with hindsight, of course, see as the rational course of action. But it's much more about the kind of personalities and relationships between these men. Because once again, you have John quite willing to undermine his former kingdom, at least in the sense of distracting its king from the mission at hand by going to war with him. And John has his second kind of prestigious and slightly unlikely job, in the sense that he is, with his brilliant military track record of getting a crusading army captured, appointed as a papal commander of the kind of Pope's forces that he amasses. To go on a slight tangent, I know it's happened before, but it seems a bit strange for the Pope to be raising an army and then choosing a kind of general. How and why has that process come about?
Right. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't make sense to us. But in fact, there's a long tradition of popes organizing armies, leading armies, in most cases not commanding them themselves. You find a military man to do the job. And this is because the Pope is a political figure with political interests. And in this particular case, if he wants to excommunicate an emperor and a king and kick him off his throne, you can't do that just by announcing it. You've actually got to be able to enforce it. So it's a big step for the Pope to do that. He's putting his prestige on the line. He needs to win to show that his campaign is justified and is holy. Likewise, Frederick is realizing that if he wins, not only will he show that he is the more holy of the two, but if he can get back Jerusalem as well, then he's got proof that God is on his side. So it's a wonderful game of one-upmanship, where by success you prove that God is with you. And in the end, Frederick is the winner. He's the one who not only negotiates his way back to taking possession of Jerusalem, a very threadbare victory, but it is a victory all the same in the Holy Land. But he then comes back to Italy and Sicily, where John has been leading a campaign against him, and duly chases John out of the kingdom. So it's game, set, and match for Frederick. And once again, John looks like he has no prospects. This is a landless king once again, an ex-king, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, if we use medieval metrics of, victories and personal success is endowed by God, it seems like John really has done something bad in his life, because he just keeps getting hit by these these bad fortune, bad luck, but also, I guess, military defeats, which can't entirely be put down to luck too. Now, he's now at a bit of a crossroads, is John, because he's been king of Jerusalem, as you say. Now he's an ex-king. He had a daughter, almost, you could say a beginning of a dynasty out in Jerusalem, but she's dead. Jerusalem is in the hands of someone he despises. His career as papal commander is kind of over with that war with Frederick being over. And it's not exactly like he's a soldier of fortune with a great track record to, appeal to the rulers of Europe with. And yet, in, just a short space of time, relatively speaking, John finds himself reaching new career heights in a way.
Yeah.
How does that come about?
It is bizarre. Having reached this sort of stage with seemingly no prospects and being effectively an ex-king who's been discarded, John then goes on remarkably quickly to get the title of emperor, which is, if anything, even higher than a title of king. And this is to rule the Latin Empire in Constantinople. That's the state founded by the Fourth Crusaders in Constantinople. It's a very bizarre turn of events. But again, the explanation is about what happens when a vulnerable frontier state has dynastic problems, when you have a ruler who cannot really rule for themselves. So earlier, we had a female ruler, Maria, who John married to become king of Jerusalem. Now we've got a young boy, Baldwin II, who is the emperor of Constantinople, and he's clearly not capable of doing it yet. And Constantinople itself is in real trouble and needs all the help it can get. In fact, the barons of Constantinople have even tried talking to one of their greatest enemies, the Bulgarian Tsar, to see if he's interested in becoming regent of Constantinople. And this doesn't work. Then they look to the west, and here is where John's past record actually does work in his favor, because who is the obvious candidate to take over a beleaguered realm on the frontier of the Western world? Well, if you've been king of Jerusalem, you've been there and done that. You've sat in a prestigious place and desperately tried to defend it. The Pope also kind of wants John out of the way, because he would quite like to make peace with Frederick now. And the fact that John is constantly shouting, "I should be king of Jerusalem" at him, is clearly going to get him down a bit. So if he can compensate John with another role, and in fact an even better title elsewhere, then that solves another political problem. So amazingly, after this record, as we're saying, largely of failure and defeat, John gets offered another very major job, and this time being Latin Emperor of Constantinople.
So he's been given a new crown, an even better one, as an emperor. And yet, in some ways, it's a bit of a poison chalice. It's maybe not quite as much as we said Jerusalem's in this little enclave on the coast, not in a great position. Arguably, the Latin Empire of Constantinople, founded by the Fourth Crusaders, is in an even worse strategic position. So can you paint a picture for us? John gets out there in the early 1230s. This state has only existed for, 25 years? What position is the Latin Empire that he inherits in?
A terrible one, to be pretty frank. This state is in huge trouble almost from the very beginning. Within a year of being founded, the first emperor has been dragged off into captivity and never seen again. It's desperately put back onto its feet by various French knights and the Venetians, who have particularly strong interest in the survival and prosperity of the empire. But at the end of the day, it is a pygmy, stuck between much bigger, more powerful forces. The Bulgarians on one side and the Nicaeans, these are the Greeks who think they should have Constantinople back, on the other side. So it's the worst possible world where you have the city that everybody wants, but you're also much weaker than your enemies and rivals. So it's a terrible prospect, to be frank. You'd only do it if you're really keen to become an emperor.
And yeah, not really emperor of very much, pretty much just the city. The great Byzantine Empire is, well, thanks to the Fourth Crusade, no more, and the men who now call themselves emperors don't any longer have an empire. So given that this is a poison chalice, why do you think John takes this? I mean, I guess some of the points you've made help us explain it. And is he once again a kind of in a legal grey area? Is he regent for a child king, or does he actually get to be emperor?
Well, as you can imagine, because he got booted out of the Kingdom of Jerusalem on a technicality, he's now determined to make sure that the deal by which he'll become emperor this time is as watertight as he can make it. So this time we actually have the text. We can see the terms of the arrangement by which he becomes Latin emperor. And it spells out in legal language, firstly, that it won't be a co-emperorship or anything like that. He will be the sole emperor on his own. And Baldwin, who he's acting for, will have to wait his turn until John is dead. And it spells out in the text that John will keep Constantinople his entire life, i.e. exactly what Frederick had failed to respect in Jerusalem. So John is covering the bases and learning from his previous mistakes. Why does he want the job? I suppose it's partly a question of honour and stature. If you're somebody who's been a king, becoming basically a suppliant figure who runs around the world asking people for help is really rather demeaning. And I think he sees this is his one chance, basically, to reassume his royal status, and in fact to go one better, at least in terms of status and to imperial status. He knows that in the last resort, it's a terrible job. It's sitting on a frontier defending a city in a really terrible situation. But it's still worth taking if you're him, I think.
I think it's really fascinating, this idea of parachuting in regents who then get to say they're kings for life. I mean, you're effectively dethroning young Baldwin in favour of just an outsider with no dynastic connection whatsoever. And this time he's not even marrying somebody to get the throne. He's just coming in and telling a boy that he's in charge till he dies.
Yes, I mean, he does do that. But they do try and make a family link so that Baldwin is married to John's daughter, Mary. So John, by this time, has had a second and a third marriage that we haven't yet talked about, less important than his first, by which he became King of Jerusalem. So they try and link John into the Latin imperial family through this marriage. And I think he hopes that he will be a success as Latin emperor and be able to carve out lordships for his sons as well by this point. It doesn't happen, but they're clearly trying to ensure that that it isn't just a usurpation. Instead, that John will become part of Baldwin's family and they will all act together. It doesn't always work out like that, but that's the idea.
One of the things that I think is interesting is that the Byzantines always had, very commonly, at least, very often, they had a co-emperor. So you would have a boy king, but then you would bring in a general or whatever, and they would be co-emperor. And of course, there's only one who has the power, but at least on the face of it, you're accepting that, this is where he's deriving his authority from. I find it fascinating that John had good reason for it, I think, based on his career, but the idea that, I guess, from the desperation of their position, they were willing, the Latin Constantinople nobles, just to, park those kind of dynastic niceties in order to get in a guy with at least some track record. Speaking of which, he's in an impossible position, we've said. What does he make of it? How does he do as Emperor of Constantinople?
Well, it's kind of similar in some ways to his performance as King of Jerusalem earlier. We don't know that much, certainly about his sort of early few years. But he has basically got a problem. He's gone out with a load of knights, sort of, again, an entourage crusade, if you like. If he doesn't start fighting immediately, if there isn't a war to fight, then frankly, there's no point in them being there and they may as well come home. But on the other hand, the political enemies out there are much, much stronger than he is. So there's no point in leading an army on an expedition that's just going to end in a major defeat. So he basically seems to decide that prudence is the best course of action. He sits tight for a few years, stockpiling money and resources as much as he can. But it does mean that a lot of his entourage just give up and go home. A lot of chroniclers talk about him being lazy and avaricious. So just making money, basically. He's not. He's desperately trying to stockpile his resources. And in fact, he's waiting for an opportunity to strike. He finally gets a little opportunity when he does a small campaign on the other side of the Dardanelles Strait in 1233, almost the site of the Gallipoli campaign in World War I. But nothing much comes of it. So again, it's very similar to life as King of Jerusalem. He can't make that great big victory without much more support from the West, and that support is not forthcoming.
And after his, I guess, failure to make an impact as king, as emperor, doing him a disservice there, he then finds himself in a very tricky situation in what has been termed the War of the Three Johns.
Yeah. This is a slightly specious label. So we have one John, which is Brienne, obviously. Then we have the Nicaean Emperor, John Vatatzes. And then we have John Asen, Ivan Asen, Ivan, of course, meaning John, who is the Bulgarian Tsar. And this is the big event of John's reign. So if we picture Constantinople as a tiny little island with two big forces on either side, the Bulgarians and the Nicaeans, well, you might be able to keep one of them at bay, but what do you do if they both join forces? And that's exactly what happens on this occasion. So in 1235-6, the Bulgarians on the one side and the Nicaeans on the other make an alliance and together march on Constantinople. And clearly they're intending to carve it up between the two of them. So this is extremis. It doesn't get more dangerous than this. And we're pleased to report that John, for once, is able to notch up a considerable success, where when the siege of the city is at its height, he does seem to gallop out of the city once or twice at the head of his knights and achieve at least a tactical victory that looks good on paper and is able to revive some morale. In fact, all he's able to do is to just hold on in Constantinople whilst naval support comes in from the Venetians and from other supporters of the Latin Empire down in Greece. This certainly helps, but the thing that really saves Constantinople is that the Bulgarians and Nicaeans can't remain friends for very long and eventually quit the siege, arguing with each other. So the summary of this really is that John has at least saved Constantinople and has got a big achievement to chalk up for his reign as Latin Emperor just before he dies.
Yes, because he dies, I believe, the following year in 1237. The young king or the young Emperor Baldwin succeeds him, but the empire doesn't exactly go from strength to strength after that. I think it's fair to say.
That's right. So Baldwin, in the end, is the last ruling emperor of Constantinople. He staggers on, ruling the empire down to 1261, but then he's booted out. So John kept it going, but not much more than that in the grand scheme of things.
So if we kind of look at John's career in summary, in retrospect, the whole kind of story, I mean, we've gone with the title of this episode, History's Most Varied Career, because this is a guy who has gone from a fairly middling noble position to be a king, to be an emperor, to be a papal commander, to lead a crusade, to save what was, at least before the Fourth Crusade, the greatest city in Christendom, albeit from other Christians. How do you think his career, in retrospect, is it just failures and kind of him getting done over time and again, or do you think he can be kind of look back at some of those achievements and think, it was actually quite a remarkable and successful career?
And if you consider it purely from his perspective, it's definitely a successful career in that, to start out, as you said, as a mid-ranking knight, and to end up having been a king and an emperor, that's pretty impressive. Not many people can match that. It's true, what those careers actually involve is very hard and difficult and taxing. They look good on paper, but in practice, both jobs involve sitting on the very edges of the Latin Western world, fighting desperately hard to sustain what, in the grand scheme of things, is ultimately a losing battle. So they're not actually very attractive prospects. So I suppose I would sum it up as a career of a very hard graft, actually. It's hard work. It's difficult. I wouldn't blame him so hard for some of his defeats, but point out the odds that he's up against in the causes he's trying to sustain. But in his own terms, he's raised his name, the Brienne family, very, very high. He's laid the foundations for the family's continued and very interesting career that they have for the next couple of centuries. So I think he'd be pretty pleased with himself.
Yeah, briefly, I mean, we've said there the Latin Empire didn't last much longer, well, nearly another kind of 20 years or so. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, I think, lasts another 100 years, does it, after John? Mm-hmm. But what about his family? He didn't quite manage to set up a dynasty in either Jerusalem or in Constantinople. Do the Briennes, benefit from the heights that John reached?
Yes, they do. I mean, they don't really manage in the end to get back those royal and imperial titles. They try very hard. They come quite close to getting the crown of Cyprus not long afterwards. But basically, they have a very far-flung and impressive and expansive career after that. We find them all over the place. We find Briennes in Spain, in Scotland, in the Low Countries, in Florence, in southern Italy, in Sicily, in the Holy Land. They get all over the place. And largely this is because of the renown and prestige and connections that John has forged in his career. So he certainly does well by his family.
Interesting that the kind of family is almost as itinerant as John himself in kinds of serving and carving out land holdings in pretty much anywhere you can. And a kind of an impressive legacy, I suppose, for someone who maybe didn't quite see the fruits of his labours in his own life, perhaps. There was one question that did come to mind looking at his life story as a whole, and that would be the fact that he is king of different states at different times. Being king in medieval times of more than one state, fairly common if you can acquire through marriage or conquest or whatever. But is he fairly unique in being king of different places at different times, an itinerant king?
It is pretty rare. I mean, his record of sort of traveling around the Mediterranean trying to get hold of crowns. And in later mythologizing, it's suggested that perhaps he tried to become king of England, that maybe he tried to have Damietta turned into a kingdom. As we know, he tried to get hold of the kingdom of Cilicia and he didn't get that. And that's on top of the kingdoms of Jerusalem and the Latin Empire, which he did actually get. So he does become, if you like, the crown man, the man who's constantly on the hunt for a crown. it's not quite as rare as it might sound, in the sense that in the last resort, there are ambitious nobles all over the place looking to build up their careers, and the crown is the ultimate attribute that you're looking for. What is unusual about John, though, is the nature of the crowns he actually gets. The crown of Jerusalem, the crown of Constantinople. These are the biggest, most prestigious crowns that there are in the Middle East, in the Near East, I should say. And it's fascinating that the only person in history to get hold of both of them was somebody who was born to neither of them.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it a kind of one of those amazing varied careers, is the fact that, he's both at different points Latin Emperor of Constantinople and King of Jerusalem. And like you say, neither of them he inherited. He kind of is selected, which is quite unique as well, to do that. So in summary, John's career, like we've said, you could say that there's a lot of failures. There's a lot of states that there's 2 states that he tries to kind of shepherd to better times, but doesn't really succeed. Militarily, we've got the success in the siege of Constantinople, but then successfully defending Constantinople is kind of the default. There's only a couple of times in history where it isn't. In summary, would you say John is plagued just by bad luck, bad circumstances, or do you think he just and wasn't that good a king or military commander?
I'm not sure I would say it's either bad luck or sort of pin the blame on him personally about failures of his own. What we've been saying all along is that he's a mid-ranking person who gets projected into these top-notch roles. And is it surprising that he lacks the resource base to inject those roles with the men, the money, the power, the influence they really need? That's why later the King of Jerusalem tries Frederick II, who they hope will have all those things. So when you look at John's career of struggle, I think it's more, this is what happens if you try to play that top-notch role with not quite the resource base to back it up. Again, I'd be tempted to give him the benefit of the doubt and say it's not a bad performance considering what he was up against. Maybe it's a triumph of networking over sheer power.
It's a good way to put it, the medieval networker. And look where it gets you, eh?
Yeah.
Gets you some of the greatest thrones in Christendom. Well, I think all that remains is to say thank you so much to Guy Perry for joining us. He is, as we've said, the expert on John of Brienne, so it's really great for him. We really appreciate him giving up his time to talk to us about such a fascinating man. And he's written a book about the Briennes. He's written a biography of John of Brienne, which is actually, for an academic book, quite reasonably priced, I must say. I was quite surprised. And so thank you so much for joining us, John. John?
We've said John so much this episode.
I've got 3 Johns in my head.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Guy.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So, from us here at History's Most, I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex. And thank you so much for listening to History's Most.